A congressman from Texas made one of the most important decisions of the Cold War. Charlie Wilson was a politician who loved whiskey, loved women, loved parties. But he loved something else too: hating the Soviets. When he heard the story of the Afghan Mujahideen, he made his decision. "I will help these people," he said. "I will defeat the Soviets." He used his connections in Congress. He worked with the CIA, and he accomplished what seemed impossible. He made sure Stinger missiles were sent to Afghanistan. The CIA did not want them at first. "Too risky," they said. "If the Soviets capture the missile, they will learn our technology. If the American hand is seen, the war will escalate." Wilson insisted, and he won. In 1986, the first Stingers arrived in Afghanistan. Within months, Soviet helicopter losses exploded. Within a year, Moscow decided to withdraw. One congressman had defeated a superpower. This is the story of how Charlie Wilson changed the Cold War. How a handful of shoulder-fired missiles turned the tide of battle, and how the weapon that won the war became a nightmare that haunted America for decades. Charles Nesbitt Wilson was not your typical politician. He was born in Trinity, Texas in 1933. Tall, handsome, charming. He served in the Navy, then went to law school. He entered politics in the 1960s, first in the Texas state legislature, then in the United States Congress, starting in 1973. Wilson represented a conservative district in East Texas. His constituents cared about oil, timber, and keeping the government out of their business. Foreign policy was not their priority, but it was Wilson's passion, specifically fighting communism. Wilson was a cold warrior through and through. He believed the Soviet Union was an evil empire that had to be stopped. He saw every conflict in the world through the lens of the superpower struggle. He was also a notorious playboy. His office was staffed by attractive young women he called Charlie's Angels. He drank heavily. He partied constantly. He was investigated multiple times for drug use and ethics violations. None of this hurt his career. His constituents loved him. He delivered for his district, and he won election after election. By the early 1980s, Wilson had positioned himself on the House Appropriations Committee, specifically the Subcommittee on Defense. This gave him enormous power over how America spent its military and intelligence budgets. He was about to use that power in ways no one expected. On December 24, 1979, Soviet forces crossed into Afghanistan. The invasion was swift and brutal. Within days, Soviet troops controlled Kabul. The Afghan president was executed and replaced with a Soviet puppet. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers poured into the country. The Soviets expected a quick victory. Afghanistan was a poor, backward nation with no modern military. The Afghan army had already been weakened by internal coups and purges. Resistance would be minimal. They were catastrophically wrong. Afghanistan had been the graveyard of empires for centuries. The British had learned this lesson in the 19th century. Now the Soviets would learn it again. The Afghan resistance coalesced around the Mujahideen, Islamic fighters who declared jihad against the Soviet invaders. They came from every tribe, every region, every ethnic group. They were united by faith and by hatred of foreign occupation. The Mujahideen had courage, they had determination, they had knowledge of the terrain. What they did not have was weapons capable of fighting a modern superpower. Their rifles dated from World War II. Their ammunition was scarce. They had no anti-aircraft weapons, no anti-tank missiles, no modern communications equipment. Against Soviet helicopters and jets and tanks, they were hopelessly outmatched. If you want to discover the secret technologies and untold stories of the Cold War, subscribe to our channel. We bring you new content every week. Charlie Wilson first became interested in Afghanistan in 1980. He was sitting in a hot tub in Las Vegas with a former beauty queen when he happened to see a news report about Afghan refugees. The images of suffering moved him. He decided to learn more. What he learned made him angry. The Soviets were committing atrocities. Villages were being destroyed. Civilians were being massacred. And the United States was doing almost nothing to help. The CIA had a covert program to support the Mujahideen, but it was tiny, a few $1 million a year. Enough to buy some old rifles and ammunition. Not enough to make a real difference. Wilson flew to Pakistan to see the situation firsthand. He visited refugee camps where millions of Afghans had fled. He met with Mujahideen commanders who told him what they needed. Anti-aircraft weapons, something that could stop the helicopters. He returned to Washington with a mission. He would increase American support for the Afghan resistance. He would give them the weapons they needed to win. Wilson began lobbying his colleagues on the Appropriations Committee. He was persuasive, persistent, and willing to trade favors. Slowly, the budget for the Afghan program began to grow. In 1983, the CIA's Afghan budget was $30 million. By 1984, Wilson had pushed it to $50 million. By 1985, it was over $200 million. But money was not enough. The Mujahideen needed a specific weapon, one that could neutralize the Soviet air advantage. They needed the Stinger. The FIM-92 Stinger was the most advanced man-portable air defense system in the world. Developed by General Dynamics in the 1970s, it represented the cutting edge of American military technology. The missile used a sophisticated infrared seeker that could track aircraft by their heat signature. It had built-in countermeasures to defeat flares and other decoys. A single soldier could carry it. A few hours of training were enough to operate it, and it could knock a helicopter or low-flying jet out of the sky from more than 4 kilometers away. The Mujahideen had been begging for Stingers since the early 80s. The CIA had consistently refused. The concerns were legitimate. The Stinger was classified technology. If one fell into Soviet hands, they could reverse engineer it and develop countermeasures. If one was traced back to America, it would prove direct U.S. involvement in the war. There was also the proliferation risk. Once Stingers were in Afghanistan, there was no guarantee they would stay there. They could end up with terrorists, with hostile nations, with anyone willing to pay for them. The State Department opposed sending Stingers. The Pentagon opposed it. The CIA opposed it. Everyone with responsibility for the decision said no. Charlie Wilson said yes. He lobbied relentlessly. He built coalitions in Congress. He found allies in the CIA who shared his views, including a case officer named Gust Averkotos, who became his partner in the operation. Wilson argued that the risks of inaction were greater than the risks of action. Without effective anti-aircraft weapons, the Mujahideen would eventually be defeated. Afghanistan would become a Soviet satellite. The balance of power would shift in Moscow's favor. In early 1986, the Reagan administration finally approved the transfer. The first Stinger missiles arrived in Afghanistan in September. The war was about to change forever. The Stinger was useless without trained operators. The CIA had to teach Afghan fighters how to use it. This presented challenges. Many Mujahideen were illiterate. They had never used sophisticated electronics. The technical manuals meant nothing to them. The CIA developed a simplified training program. Pakistani instructors, trained by Americans, worked with small groups of Mujahideen fighters. They taught them how to identify targets, how to acquire lock, how to fire, how to maintain the weapon. The training took about 2 weeks. By the end, a farmer who had never seen modern technology could shoot down a Soviet helicopter. Security was paramount. The CIA limited the number of Stingers distributed at any one time. Each missile was assigned to a specific commander who was responsible for its use. Detailed records were kept of every firing. The Mujahideen proved to be excellent students. They were motivated and disciplined. They understood that the Stinger was their path to victory. The first Stinger teams infiltrated back into Afghanistan in September 1986. They carried the missiles on their backs, hiking over mountain passes, avoiding Soviet patrols. They were about to announce their presence in spectacular fashion. September 25, 1986. near Jalalabad, eastern Afghanistan. A Mujahideen commander named Engineer Ghaffar led a team of fighters to a position overlooking the Jalalabad airfield. They carried 3 Stinger missiles, among the first to reach Afghanistan. 3 Soviet Mi-24 Hind helicopters appeared, flying a routine patrol. The Hinds had dominated Afghan skies for years. Their pilots had no reason to fear the ground below. Ghaffar shouldered the first Stinger and locked onto the lead helicopter. He fired. The missile streaked toward the target but missed, possibly due to operator error. He grabbed a second Stinger. This time, his aim was true. The missile struck the second Hind, which exploded in a fireball and crashed. A third Mujahideen fighter engaged the remaining helicopter with another Stinger. Direct hit. The third Hind went down in flames. 2 Soviet helicopters destroyed in less than 2 minutes. The crews had no chance to react. They had no warning. They simply died. News of the engagement spread like wildfire through the Mujahideen. For the first time, they had a weapon that could reliably destroy Soviet aircraft. The psychological impact was enormous. For the Soviets, the implications were terrifying. Their helicopters, which had been operating with impunity, were suddenly vulnerable. Pilots who had flown fearlessly now had to worry about missiles streaking up from any hillside. The era of Soviet air supremacy in Afghanistan was over. The impact of the Stinger was immediate and devastating. Before the Stinger, the Soviets were losing perhaps 1 aircraft per month to ground fire. After the Stinger, losses increased dramatically. Some estimates suggest the Soviets lost over 250 aircraft to Stingers during the war. But the physical destruction was only part of the story. The psychological impact was even greater. Soviet pilots changed their tactics. They flew higher to stay above Stinger range, which reduced their effectiveness. They avoided known Mujahideen positions, which limited their operational flexibility. They became cautious, defensive, reactive. The helicopter gunships that had terrorized Afghan villages could no longer operate freely. The transport helicopters that supplied remote outposts now faced deadly risk. The close air support that had saved Soviet ground forces was suddenly unreliable. The Mujahideen, meanwhile, grew bolder. With the threat from the air reduced, they could mass their forces for larger attacks. They could move more freely. They could challenge Soviet control of territory they had not dared contest before. The momentum of the war shifted. The Soviets, who had been slowly grinding down the resistance, now found themselves on the defensive. Casualties mounted. Morale plummeted. In Moscow, the leadership began to question whether Afghanistan was worth the cost. The war that was supposed to last months was now entering its 7th year. Victory seemed no closer than it had in 1980. The Stinger had not single-handedly won the war, but it had broken the Soviet will to fight it. By 1987, the Soviet leadership had seen enough. The war was costing billions of rubles annually. Thousands of Soviet soldiers had died. Tens of thousands more had been wounded, and there was no end in sight. Mikhail Gorbachev, who had become Soviet leader in 1985, was trying to reform the Soviet system. He needed to reduce military spending and improve relations with the West. Afghanistan was an obstacle to both goals. The Stinger had made the situation untenable. Soviet commanders reported that their air power was being neutralized. Without air superiority, they could not defeat the Mujahideen. Without defeating the Mujahideen, they could not stabilize Afghanistan. In February 1988, Gorbachev announced that Soviet forces would begin withdrawing from Afghanistan. The process would take 1 year. On February 15, 1989, the last Soviet soldier crossed the Friendship Bridge back into the USSR. General Boris Gromov, commander of Soviet forces, walked across the bridge alone, symbolically the last man out. The Soviet Union had lost its Vietnam. The war had killed approximately 15,000 Soviet soldiers and wounded 35,000 more. It had cost billions of dollars. It had damaged Soviet prestige around the world. And it had begun the process that would, within 2 years, lead to the collapse of the Soviet Union itself. Charlie Wilson watched the withdrawal from Washington with satisfaction. He had helped make it happen. A congressman from Texas, working with a handful of CIA officers, had helped defeat a superpower. Victory came with a price. The CIA had flooded Afghanistan with weapons during the war. Stingers were only the most famous example. There were also anti-tank missiles, machine guns, explosives, and millions of rounds of ammunition. When the Soviets left, the weapons stayed. The Mujahideen who had used them against the Soviets now used them against each other. Afghanistan descended into civil war. The Stingers were particularly concerning. The CIA had sent between 500 and 2,000 missiles to Afghanistan, depending on which estimate you believe. They had recovered perhaps 50. The rest were unaccounted for. Some were used up during the war. Some were destroyed or became inoperable. But hundreds potentially remained in circulation, held by warlords, sold on the black market, perhaps acquired by terrorist groups. The nightmare scenario was obvious. A Stinger in the hands of terrorists could bring down a civilian airliner. The same weapon that had defeated the Soviets could be turned against America. The CIA launched a frantic buyback program. They offered $100,000 for every Stinger returned. Later, they increased the offer to $150,000, then $200,000. The results were disappointing. Some missiles came back, most did not. The Mujahideen commanders knew the Stingers were valuable. Why sell them for a one-time payment when you could use them as leverage? For decades afterward, American intelligence tracked reports of Stinger sightings around the world. Some turned up in Iran, possibly sold by Afghan commanders. Some were reportedly offered to terrorist groups. Some simply vanished. The weapon that won the war had become a source of ongoing anxiety. The consequences of the Afghan war extended far beyond the Cold War. The Mujahideen who had defeated the Soviets did not disappear. Many continued fighting against each other, against the Afghan government, against new enemies. Among those who had fought in Afghanistan was a young Saudi named Osama bin Laden. He had come to Afghanistan to support the Mujahideen with money and eventually with fighters. He had learned lessons about guerrilla warfare, about using asymmetric tactics against superpowers, about the power of faith and determination. When the Soviets left, bin Laden returned to Saudi Arabia, then moved to Sudan, then back to Afghanistan. He built an organization called Al-Qaeda. He declared war on America. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda attacked the United States. Nearly 3,000 people died. America responded by invading Afghanistan, the same country where it had once supported the Mujahideen. The irony was bitter. The weapons America had sent to defeat the Soviets were now potentially in the hands of people who wanted to attack America. The fighters America had supported were now enemies. Charlie Wilson saw the connection. In his later years, he acknowledged that America had made mistakes after the Soviet withdrawal. "We should have stayed engaged," he said. "We should have helped rebuild Afghanistan. Instead, we walked away and left chaos behind." Wilson died in 2010. He lived long enough to see the consequences of the war he had helped win, both the triumph and the tragedy. The Stinger's role in Afghanistan became legendary. Military analysts debated for years how decisive the missile really was. Some argued it was the decisive factor that broke Soviet will. Others noted that the Soviets were already considering withdrawal before the Stinger arrived. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The Stinger did not single-handedly win the war, but it accelerated the end. It demonstrated that Soviet air power could be countered by relatively simple weapons. It gave the Mujahideen hope and the Soviets despair. The lessons of Afghanistan influenced military thinking for decades. The vulnerability of helicopters to shoulder-fired missiles became a major concern. New aircraft were designed with better defenses. New tactics emphasized avoiding the Stinger threat. For Charlie Wilson, Afghanistan was the defining achievement of his career. He had seen a cause, committed to it, and made a difference. Few politicians could claim as much. The story was later told in a book and a movie, both titled Charlie Wilson's War. Tom Hanks played Wilson in the film. The congressman who loved whiskey and women became an unlikely hero. But the fuller legacy is more complicated. America's intervention in Afghanistan helped defeat the Soviet Union. It also helped create conditions for the rise of the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. The same war that ended one threat planted the seeds of another. The Stinger missile remains in service today, though upgraded versions have replaced the original. It is still one of the most effective man-portable air defense systems in the world. It has been used in conflicts from the Persian Gulf to Ukraine. Every time a soldier shoulders a Stinger and brings down an enemy aircraft, they echo what happened in the mountains of Afghanistan nearly 40 years ago. A simple weapon, a determined fighter, and the moment when the sky stopped belonging to the enemy. That is the legacy of Charlie Wilson's War.